take a look at some examples of co-creation, and I mean I can give you very specific ones from different universities, but as a sort of introduction, let's have a look at some kind of general ideas of what might be involved. So here's some these won't maybe rock your boat too much to start with, but actually when we ask students to fill in a course feedback questionnaire, that's probably the first point people go when they say, how do we involve students in the curriculum? Well, most of us should be getting feedback from our students, and what we do with that feedback is probably might show different shades of levels of participation by students. So do we invite our students back in to help us make sense of that feedback and decide what we're going to do in terms of taking action on the basis of the feedback? Or does the feedback sit nicely in a banker's box on a shelf at the back of the office or get sent to somebody centrally in the university where it's never seen again? So there are lots of different ways that feedback might be used, but potentially that could be one way of involving students. Students choosing a topic for their research project, that might, again, not seem like we're being highly radical here, but that's one of those opportunities which most students will get at some point during their time at university, where they have more say in the subject that they choose to study, whether that's for maybe 3 months, 6 months, depending on how long perhaps a research project lasts. So most students report that that's something they enjoy because they've had much more say and over what they choose to study, and they tend to have more ownership over it. So let's go a little bit more radical now. Students co-designing marking criteria with staff. I don't know if anybody in the room has tried this, but the idea that actually sitting down with students and saying, what would a good essay consist of? What do you think we should award marks for in an essay on this topic? Or what about a lab report? What should a good lab report look like? Let's now sit down and talk about the criteria we think a good lab report should have. So actually that can be quite a good way of students learning more about how to best meet the needs that they've got to meet in terms of meeting their intended learning outcomes by actually being involved in designing those criteria. Students and staff collaborating to choose a course textbook. There's a really nice example from Elon University in North Carolina where they get their students to actually sit on a curriculum design committee. So they get students from the previous year and students who are going to be studying the course. And one of the things they talked about was that the students hated the current textbook. So they said, okay, we need to put this on the table and say, let's sort this out, because there were so many complaints about this textbook. So they looked across the states and they gathered 25 textbooks that were used for this subject across the states. And they said, we're going to design a rubric together as to how we would judge the quality of a good textbook, what we're looking for. And then all of us on the planning committee, the curriculum design committee, are going to take 3 of these books away over the Christmas holidays, and we're going to judge them against this rubric. Anything that scores lower than X will be rejected, and then we'll look at what we're left with, and as a committee we'll come up with what we think we're going to move towards using as the new textbook. So they did this, and they said that actually one of the key things that worked really well with this was very, very early on, the old textbook got rejected. And the students said immediately there was this kind of, they're taking us seriously, actually. They are listening to us. So not just they're listening to us, but they're taking action on the basis of listening to us. So often students talk about how we say we're going to let them participate in things, but it doesn't always actually translate into something meaningful. So they saw that as actually a really key moment early on, that the students were convinced they were being taken seriously rather than just a kind of tokenistic part of the committee. So quite a nice example. I'm not suggesting you change your textbooks if they're not needing to be changed, but so it depends on the context in which you're in. So students influencing the content of the curriculum, that could be in a range of different ways. They could be choosing perhaps between 2 or 3 different example cases you might use to illustrate something. So it could be a choice, or perhaps that's about having students who studied the course last year influencing perhaps different directions in terms of the content of the course. That's often one of the ones where people say to me, how can a first-year student in their first week have a say in the content of the curriculum? And I would say that's quite challenging, because they probably don't know as much as you do about the subject. But they may still have quite a lot of ideas about the timetable. They may still have views about which kinds of assessments they prefer and which ones they find useful for their learning. So, and we'll come back to that in terms of how first years maybe can be involved. Students becoming full members of a curriculum design team, I've mentioned that. And then students designing a virtual learning environment. That's something that colleagues at University College Dublin tried in their geography course. They actually got a group of students to do a summer project and redesign their virtual learning environment. And that went down really, really well with the students. I think that it had been co-designed with students. And then students designing, I've put there to just soften the blow, one of their learning outcomes or some of their learning outcomes. Okay, now that probably sounds slightly more radical than the first one and where we started. But again, I guess that depends upon what stage your students are at, what size your class is, as to how manageable that would be. That's something we've certainly introduced into our own Masters in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education. So that's academic members of staff. And we're saying to them in their dissertation, you should be people that have an idea what you would like to learn from your from writing a dissertation. So you're people who are capable of coming up with some of your own learning outcomes. So that's negotiated with their supervisor. And I don't see why that couldn't be introduced further down in the university and why that isn't possible in other research projects. But I do think that would depend how many students you've got, what level they're at.